Those of you who are old enough, or I should say perhaps as old as some of the rest of us are, remember with fondness certain television programs from our childhood when we didn't have 600 channels to choose from. We had typically 3 local and then usually 1 independent. And as children, we didn't really control the TV. We were given permission to watch certain things. And back during the late 60s and early 70s, the original Mission Impossible appeared, I believe it was on CBS. And it always began with this scene here, with Mr. Phelps receiving his assignment on a small reel-to-reel tape recorder. I actually received one of these as a Christmas gift one year, sometime in that window of time. And for those of you who are not familiar, we have something of a remake in the Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movies, but Mr. Phelps would always hear his assignment spoken to him over this tape recorder and said, you know, should you choose to take this assignment, yada, yada, yada. Just know that this tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds. And we got to watch smoke billowing from the machine. In my reading into this week's portion in the book of Revelation regarding the 7 churches, and we're now finally to church number 6, I confess once again that this has been a daunting assignment for me, because I realize how easy it is to fall into past patterns and the patterns that others choose to make this strictly prophetic words about the history of Christianity from the birthing of the church in the book of Acts all the way until the second coming of Christ, and then beyond that as the book of Revelations unfolds. I don't have a problem with that historical perspective because it fits very neatly into that, and you don't need me to rehearse all that. There are plenty of other preachers out there that will show you their charts and their graphs to indicate all of that, and that's all fine and good, but for our purposes, to look for meaning in these ancient yet living words from Jesus to John, to these 7 churches, to try to find meaning in there to help churches here and now is really our objective. And because my primary sense of calling right now, albeit limited in opportunities to express itself or to demonstrate itself, is to come alongside of churches that aren't doing well. And since most of these churches in the book of Revelations, you know, they're characterized by Jesus in a way that there are some takeaways in terms of their conduct and their character and their attitude and their belief systems and their practices as to whether it's something that pleases God and honors God and that God blesses or not. And so it's with that in mind that we bit off a whole lot more than we thought we were going to chew on during this time. So when I came to read this passage about the 6th church that John writes to, I didn't think about Mission Impossible. I thought about Mission Possible. Because in the churches that I have dealt with, interviewed with, had a chance to minister to in this season of my life, more times than not, the excuses are very long on why they're not experiencing what many would call the blessing of God. They're not experiencing health or growth. They're not reaching people. They're not advancing the kingdom. They're sort of an outpost holding down their little postage-sized piece of real estate until they all check out or until Jesus comes back. And I hear more words about what is not possible than about what is possible. And so when I come and read these words to this church, the 6th church of the 7 churches, then I don't read Mission Impossible, I read Mission Possible. So that's what we're titling this, Mission Possible from Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. And just some initial observations. And I find myself doing this because as in the book of Acts, when we spent over a year going through it verse by verse, and because I had never done that before, it forced me to look at it and see things and recognize some things that perhaps I had not done so before. The same thing has been true with these 7 churches. And so as I read the opening verses verses 7 and the first part of verse 8, then it led me to say, well, there's just some initial or some general observations that I want to make, not just about the address to this church, but all of them, to sort of put this in context. That first, that Jesus is presented as multifaceted. And sometimes I get the impression from God's people that's not true about Jesus. They've got a fixture of Jesus and what he looks like and how he acted and what he expects, and it wasn't multifaceted. And yet, when I read Jesus' words through John to these churches, I find him as multifaceted. And that Jesus' opening is not the same for every church. Now, it is the same for some, but not for all of them. And so take note of these two aspects as we read these two verses, and then we'll come back and resume from there. Revelation 2, verse 1 said, "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this, I know your deeds." So there's a description of Jesus here with these words that aren't repeated to any of the other 7 churches. And then his word, as he leads into his comments to them, is, I know your deeds. To the second church, and to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you're rich, and the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. So once again, we have a description of Jesus, but it's a decidedly different description. And his initial words then to the church of Smyrna are not, I know your deeds, but I know your tribulation, and etc. To the third church, chapter 2, verse 12. And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell. Once again, a decidedly different depiction or aspect or a facet of Jesus. And then his intro of his word to them is, I know where you dwell. And then to the fourth church, verse 18. And to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet are like burnished bronze, says this, I know your deeds. You sort of get the picture? I don't know why in my reading through these others as we were working through them, I didn't mention that or take note of it or pay particular attention to it. I was more interested in what he said to those churches than the description of the ones saying these words. Then in Revelation 3 and verse 1, we saw this last week. To the angel of the church in Sardis write, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this, I know your deeds. And then finally, the intro to this week's study in verse 7 of chapter 3. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one shuts, and who shuts and no one opens, says this, I know your deeds. Now, he has repeated that refrain of I know your deeds that he did to a couple of the other churches. But when he describes the one speaking, he is described as the one who is holy and true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one shuts and no one opens. And it's for that reason that we have a decidedly different word to the church at Philadelphia than we had to these other churches. And so the lesson is that Jesus is presented as multifaceted. And he doesn't always introduce everything with the same sort of introduction. So those are some just initial observations, and I'll leave it to you as to why Jesus is depicted in a slightly different way, other than to say you don't box Jesus in. You don't make him into a singular character or object, that he has more facets than we will ever be able to recognize. And it's important to see that each one of these aspects of him plays a decidedly different role in the relationship of those churches to him. So the second thing is that Jesus is in the opportunity business. Jesus is in the opportunity business. Reading in verse 8 through verse 10. He's in the opportunity business as he creates it, and then as we accept and embrace it. So let's pick up our reading. Behold, I put before you an open door, which no one can shut, because you have a little power, and I have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Now pause. It's important to read this with the right kind of emphasis to understand exactly what he is saying. I have put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have just a little power. It's just saying to them, you have a little, but you don't really have enough to do what needs to be done. I am doing it for you, because you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Verse 9. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and make them know that I have loved you, because you have kept the word of my perseverance. And I also will keep you from the hour of testing, that hour in which is about to come upon the whole earth, to test those who dwell on the earth. Jesus is in the opportunity business as he creates opportunity. You know, he's saying to them, you have a little strength, you have a little power, but what you need, in terms of my commission to you, what I left you on earth to do until I come back, is that in and of yourself, you're not smart enough, you're not wise enough, and you're not strong enough to do what needs to be done. I'm making the way for you. I'm creating an open door, and when I open a door, guess what? No one can close it. But on the other hand, if I close a door, no one can open it. And then I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan to come down and bow down at your feet, and know that not you have loved me, but that I have loved you, because you've kept my word. And I will keep you in that hour of testing. I think it's perhaps in this that this title comes in my processing this. Admittedly to you, I do more than just look at the text, and I go back and look at the language of the writers, and I'll read what commentators have to say. I actually pulled a book off my shelf from back here that I got from my dad's library. It's a set of commentaries on the book of Revelation by Dr. Criswell, who was pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas for some 50 years. And he's one of those that when he deals with this passage, he does it entirely as prophetic history. And I went back and read that, and it was nostalgic for me, knowing that these are the things that I was taught, and this comes out of a volume that I received from my dad. And on the inside, it states where we were, Liberty Baptist Church in Sherman, Texas. He got this in 1963. So we're talking, 60 years ago that he received this. And so when I read this, and I come down, and while acknowledging the potential of that historical prophetic perspective, I not only take what I read in the text and in the ancient languages and what other commentators have to say, I look back at the interactions that I have had since, really before I even surrendered to preach in 1974, because I was a part of my dad's church, and was intimately involved in that. Never held a position of leadership, but I was always there. I saw the inner workings. I heard what people said. I got to see some really cool things that God did, but then I got to see a lot of the other kind of stuff, and which is one of the reasons that I didn't volunteer to do what I ended up doing. I got drafted or sentenced. You choose whichever fits best. So I take all that into perspective when I read this, and in my mind and in my memory, I hear the words of players along the journey. Whether it was a church in Texas, or whether it was a church in Maryland, or whether it's been in the churches that I've had a privilege of attending and speaking, and perhaps looking for an opportunity to serve in South Carolina. And there's some things that are just painfully familiar across that board. That every time I went into an opportunity, felt God that led me there, I went in with open eyes, but I went in the confidence that there wasn't anything that God couldn't do. And that God wants to bless those who both want to be a blessing, but those who first want to bless Jesus and the Father by being spiritually obedient. To hear what He says, to look at what he says, to have no illusions about the implications of that, and says, I accept, sort of like Mr. Phelps in the Mission Impossible, I accept this mission and this assignment to do that. And yet what I hear from churches, whether it's those that I interviewed with in the past or churches that I went to, and we began to share the journey and began to see God at work. Or until we saw God at work, to hear their explanation of why it wasn't happening. And admittedly to you, this is sort of a frustration and a concern and angst that I share, but mine is always in the shadow of the power and the promise and the potential that God offers to us and through us, because He wants to offer it for us too, is that in our lifetime, or certainly in my lifetime, civilization, culture, society has not been on an upward trajectory. It has been on a terrible descent. And even so much so that I'm a realist. I see the world that we live in. I'm so put out in those times when I just want to zone out and watch something on TV, that my frustration now is that the question is if it's a new series and the actors are good and the storyline is good and you know there seems to be something more to it, how many episodes does it take before a primary character goes to bed with somebody he's not married to? In some of these most recent series, you give it at least 4 episodes before that happens. And I'm thinking, and it adds nothing to the story. And if that wasn't bad enough, now we've been sort of witnessing that for several decades, but you and I both know the latest one. It is when those who have subscribed, it used to be called an alternate lifestyle. The Bible called it sodomy or homosexuality. So the question becomes now in any new series, how long before you have a scene where it's man on man or woman on woman? 2 things that I want to do. Number 1 is I want to throw up. And the second thing is I just want to blow a gasket. Because I'm thinking, it is so absurd that 1/10 of 1% of the population is driving the narrative in all media, in all entertainment now. And when that happens, I'm done. I'm officially done. I don't care how good the story is. I don't care how much I like the actors or the actresses. I'm just officially done. So I don't have any illusions. And it's not going to get any better from here. Politically and every other way, it's true. And the church that we're a part of, that body of Christ that exists in 2022, that you're a part of or I'm a part of, this is the world that we're in. On one side, you've got Russia trying to gobble up Ukraine and feed in that, and the world sitting around going, hopefully we can help. We're not going to really come in there, but we hope you survive long enough till they run out of bullets, kind of thing. And I don't have answers. I just acknowledge that it's a mess. That's the world that we're in, and it's real easy to get depressed and discouraged. I choose not to. I can get ticked and I can get angry at the foolishness I see, but listen, I serve a God who's unruffled by that. Because He's got a hearing date set for all the fools and all the foolishness in which they'll stand before Him and they'll get more than I could possibly ever do to them as an act of judgment. And I'm okay with God handling that. But I don't want to subscribe to a notion that we have lost the war any more than we're losing this battle. And I've heard so much sort of naysaying and that the tendency of churches that are not expanding and not reaching people and not seeing the work of God is they have sort of this phobia, this fear about holding out against the powers of darkness. That they're huddling together in their holiness and their sanctification and their love for Jesus, and it's us against them, and they make all kinds of excuses for why they're not reaching people. This is my takeaway, for what it's worth, is the darker the night, the brighter the light. If you eliminate all forms of illumination in a space where you can't see your hand in front of your face, the smallest little light will illuminate that space. So why isn't it true if we're living in a spiritually dark world, we're talking about how dark it is rather than how bright the light is? And the light we're talking about is, we're not talking about a small light. We're talking about the light of the world, the light of life. A pattern of dying churches is focusing on how bad the world is rather on how great God is. And victory is found in using all possible means of advancing the kingdom, knowing that we win. Take this for example. We've just, we're still dealing with the aftermath of COVID, for better or worse, and there are churches like the one we happen to be privileged to be a part of that are just, they're exploding. God is just blessed, because as soon as the shutdown, the lockdown was lifted, that mandatory kind of thing, and churches that went back into business, no mandatory mass, in-person worship, then they become drawing places for people to go and attend, and they preach the gospel, and they've just seen a continued outpouring of the Spirit of God. But not all churches is that true of. And those that tended to do well at that did what they had to do during that season. Even churches that didn't have an online presence realized that that's the way to do ministry, and they jumped right into that. And it's like, some of us are old enough to remember when television first became a big thing, that there was an outcry in some corners of the kingdom of God, and it was called television. It was an evil thing, and to be avoided. What some don't know, and you'd probably be happier if I didn't tell you this, but when video first really arose in popularity, it's been around for well over 100 years, although it wasn't mainstream until well after the turn of the last century. But one of the first uses for that media was pornography. Go figure. That the devil would figure out how to use it before the people of God. But here we are in this time, and rather to bemoaning the state of the world and the state of our environment and our culture, is those who say, listen, God is the one who created the potential for the technology. We need to take and we need to regain that and sanctify that and use it for the kingdom. Realizing that a local church, that their reach of preaching the gospel can be much greater than the people who show up in their building. It can be around the world. You see, Jesus is in the opportunity business. And victory is found in using all possible means of advancing the kingdom, knowing what? Knowing that we win. I love the fact that Jesus said, listen, you persevere, you've held out. He doesn't say anything bad about this church, the Church of Philadelphia. It was founded by King Attila. His other name was Philadelphus, for which this city was named, Philadelphia. It wasn't known because it was the city of brotherly love. That's a byproduct of that word. It was named after him. And so the church that was birthed here, we know that Paul passed through here on his first missionary journey. We don't have any commentary, but I don't doubt that he preached there. He shared the gospel there. And there may have been some converts that weren't reported in the book of Acts, but we know that a church was birthed there. And so it's in that context where Jesus says through John to these people, he says, listen, you're holding out is I'm going to cause those who are members of the synagogue of Satan to come and bow down at your feet and recognize that I love you. That's a much greater testimony than them saying you love me, because I will demonstrate. And then under the greatest of tests, I'm going to keep you and protect you. When we were, our last trip to Texas for my sister-in-law's funeral service, who went to be with the Lord, been 4 weeks ago now, on their property. They live out in the country, and between the two houses, we stayed at the old house, and they're up at the main house. You walk across this pasture, and this gate stood there. And I had to take several pictures of it because I thought, you know what? There's a story in this, there's a word in this, and it came to me today. Look, this gate is standing there, but it's a gate to what? It's a gate to where? It looks like a little birdhouse out next to it, but there's no fence anywhere. Now, the story is that for a couple of years, they planted a big garden. And this was their effort to keep the local wildlife out of their garden. Well, the fence is all gone. I mean, the fence is all gone, but the gate is still there. And I think that those churches who major on the darkness of the night rather than the brightness of the light are those who come to a gate like this and say, gee, we can't go there. The gate's closed. And that's the best that their faith can do. See the gate and miss the fact that there is no fence there. Jesus said, I present opportunity. I'm the one who opens a door. Nobody can close it. You decide whether you go through it or not. But I also am the one who closes a door. And how often individuals, we do it, or how often the churches do it, they're standing in front of the door that won't open, banging on it, because that's the door they want to go through. And right next to it is the doorway that's wide open. And we look through that thing and go, I don't think so. Is there a door B or C here? And we miss out on the greatest that God has for us. It's like I'm fond of answering the question when we tell our story about going to Maryland, and somebody says, well, how did you end up in Maryland? I said, well, I was sentenced there. I had no desire to go to Maryland back in 1990. Just send me anywhere else, but I didn't have any, I never heard anything good about that. And yet God made it evident that either I could go happy or I could go anyway. And I went, decided to be happy, and it was one of the greatest blessings of our ministry in life because of what we saw God do through us. He took us into a place that Billy Graham called a preacher's graveyard, and He enabled us to touch lives by the thousands and to see people changed and transformed, and God birthed a church there. The third thing is that our reward is always in our obedience. Our reward is always in our obedience. Our present response to the circumstances reflects our eternal identity, and our present response reflects our eternal destiny. Let's read this, verse 11. I am coming quickly. Now, understand, that quickly is not in the length of time between He said these and when it was going to take place. That's not the kind of quickly He's talking about. He says, when the time comes, I'm not going to ease in. When the time comes, I'm going to be beamed in immediately. Hold fast what you have, so that no one will take your crown. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it any more. And I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God in my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. I read about this city of Philadelphia that is actually located on the southern coast of Turkey. It's right there on the Mediterranean Sea. It is a resort community by virtue of location, which is one of the reasons that it was a port there, and which is one of the reasons that Paul on his first missionary journey made his way through there. And I read because this was a favorite spot, a great place which has continued in existence up until our day, but it's an area that's subject to earthquakes. The geography there is such that, it happens quite often. So over history, they've experienced a number of those things. But it's also because it was a pagan community that they built a lot of temples to deities around there, and then other public buildings that were large and auspicious. And I read that when somebody, a citizen, did something of note for the community, that one of the things they would do to honor him was to put his name on a column on one of those conspicuous buildings, so that anybody who walked through, they could see that name and go, now that was somebody. You may not know it, your church may never have done this, but churches do this. They name buildings after people in the life of the church that were significant players. It doesn't mean that's wrong or bad, it just means it's a common practice. And that could happen, but because the area was subject to earthquakes, any earthquakes that could destroy every memory of that person that had ever existed there. It could just be reduced to rubble. And it's in that context where Jesus says to those who hold forth, that your reward is in your obedience, because it indicates where your spirit is, your identity, is not in being a citizen of this earth, but being a citizen of heaven. And I put my name on you, and I'm going to write up your name in a place that's not going to be shaken by earthquake, that's going to have the New Jerusalem on it. It's going to be enduring for all time and eternity. But your reward is not in those things. Your reward is in the fact that you've heard my voice and done what I offered you the opportunity to do, to experience my blessing and to see me work in your life. Mission impossible. When God opens a door, it's time to go through it. When God closes a door, it's time to either look for another door, or if the indication is that the door will open, just not now. This has been a challenging week for me because of this. This is a scene from my backyard. I've had a concrete pad out there for 2 years now. Had some concrete work done, had this pad poured in the hopes of building a shed. 2, maybe 3 years ago now. But it was never the right time. I never could find anybody to help. I kept trying to bait, folks from Maryland to come down and, hey, come down and help build a shed. I even tried to contract somebody locally, and, the first one that gave me a good price said, okay, and then I never heard from them again. And the ones that I followed up and talked to after that, it's like, you want how much to build a shed? And then we saw what lumber prices did. Wow. So fast forward, I've just been waiting. I've been parking lawn equipment on it, just waiting. And last year, this was day 1 of this week. This was day 2 of this week. I actually wanted to shoot the video out there this morning, but it's 90 degrees out there. And 2 days of working out in that sun, I'm reminded I'm not a child anymore. I was needing a break. Today is my break. But that is being done because in God's time, He finally opened a door for me to get it done. Now, I wish that door had included lower lumber prices because, 3 years ago you could buy a 2x4 for $3. Now it's $8. A sheet of plywood, I don't know what it was back then, but those siding pieces right there with the finished outside, $55 a sheet. No, I'm not spending ministry money on that. That is out of, our retirement funds. But anyway, the reason that's happening because of this, and this is, I wanted to tell this story. Last year, at our church, the pastor, who's a good friend of mine, came to me and says, hey, I've got some couples that I would like for you and Sarah to consider discipling. And so he gave me some names, and I said, sure, we'll do that. We're not, essentially doing anything right now because I'm waiting on the next opportunity for God to open a door. And you can't force doors open in churches. And so I reached out to several different couples, and this was one of those couples, Chuck and Christina. I reached out to them and said, Pastor Randy gave your name, and can we meet on Sunday morning, and began this journey because they didn't know us. And so a little room, a conference room, was provided for us, and so we tried to meet for a couple of weeks, and there was something that interfered those first 2 weeks, but we kept showing up and we kept waiting, and they finally came. And so we started this journey that we've been sharing now for about 6 months, 6 or 7 months. Chuck was brand new to the faith. Christina had come to faith as a child and had gotten away from it and had some bad experiences with churches and church leadership. And they'd lived their own lives, done their own thing, and then they had ended up back at this church. The pastor took them to lunch one day, shared the gospel with Chuck, drew some nice little graphics on a piece of paper, and then prayed with him, and he made a commitment to Christ. And I got to tell you, the other couples never showed up. We never heard from them, and so this has been a 2-on-2 experience on Sunday mornings, and now it's extended to Friday nights. We go out to dinner and we spend time together, and they weren't married when we first met. They are now because we had right back there, we had an informal wedding, and they're going to have a big one sometime this fall, but they need to go ahead and make it right, and so we had the pleasure of doing that. You see, I didn't know, there are several things I didn't know, is that Chuck and Christina, listen, they should have been Maryland and NAC. For those of you that know that church, they were NAC kind of people. If you know what that means, then just let that be enough said about that. But what I didn't know, Chuck had been a flooring man for a while and flooring guy, but he's moved into general contracting, doing other kind of things. And when they were over to our house for one evening, dinner and a movie, and we're talking about my projects, and he says, "Hey, let's get that shed built. He said, we're buying a house and I'm going to spend the next several months rehabbing that kind of thing. So if we're going to get that done, we need to get it done now. We got about 2 weeks. So consequently, I'm getting my shed built. I say all that as we bring this in for a landing, that opportunities come from God, that in His time and His way, that I would not have had the opportunity to work hand in hand, side by side with Chuck, and continue to speak into his life spiritual wisdom and insight, and watch him. That picture that you saw there was of them. I gave them each one a Bible when we started this journey. I gave them a reading assignment as a part of our journey together. And then when we get together and we read a passage, Chuck reads out of the Bible. And I had to get a picture of this. Wow. And when we end our times together, Chuck always wants to pray. And Chuck loves to pray over the meals when we're together. You see, that building out back, that's just a building. It was never more than that. But it's a part of God's using every aspect of our lives for His eternal purposes, and that we're advancing the church by discipling people who are going to be a part of the second site for our church that launches this fall. The pastor's already got a job lined up for him to do. You see, God creates the opportunities. It's ours to walk in obedience through those. And any church, no matter where you are, if you're willing to do what God has called you to do, stop making excuses for why it can't be done, stop being afraid of the darkness that's outside and take some light outside, be willing to make some adjustments and adaptations in your culture and your context, and listen, there's a blessing awaiting for you if you're just willing to take it in faith. Let me lead us in prayer. Father, I thank you for seeing me through this long, arduous week so far with much yet to be done, that you created an opportunity in the middle of this week for me to be able to do this video and to give me the words. And so I just commit this journey to you and those that will hear it and those who will share it and pass it on. Because Father, I believe that you believe in the church. Jesus died for the church. And you intend for the church to prosper and grow as it walks in faith. And it takes the gospel and its salt and light, wherever it happens to be, that you're going to use and bless them. And that in your time, those of the synagogue of Satan will come and bow down, recognizing that we're loved by you. So Father, thank you for your love that makes it possible. Thank you for hope that exists until Jesus comes back quickly, whenever that happens to be. And help us be on mission. Walk in faith and faithfulness until that time. It's in Jesus' name we pray, and for His sake. Amen. Let me hear from you. You can write to me at this email address. Please share this link, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube, with those you know, because we simply want people to come online that may benefit from our journey together, especially if you know of churches that are struggling. I'd love to, if it's just an online connection with somebody, to offer them some assistance and insight. I would love to be able to do that. And so pray for us in our ministry opportunities as you invite others. And then, you know, if you have questions or observations or criticisms about what we can do and how we can do it better. We're shooting this on a new piece of equipment that we bought. Don't know if it's going to make any difference. I know it don't make me look any better, but hopefully the quality of the things that we do with interviews that we're going to be resuming shortly, that it will benefit to that end. And we're able to do this because there are people who give regularly and consistently, and we're grateful for that. If you'd like to join those, there are ways of doing that online. Email me and I'll help you learn how to do that. If you want to just drop a check in the mail to Church Rebirth Ministries, we're a 501c3 organization, tax exempt, and mail it to us at this address, then we'll acknowledge that and you'll receive a contribution record at the end of the year. Well, anyway, thank you for joining us today. Pray for me that I can get this building done. God bless you.